Alright, so I'm going to provide you with an overview of the alternating treatments design. It seems like it would be helpful for you to have a more in-depth overview of that design for your research projects. An alternating treatments design really is carried out to answer the question, is one treatment more effective than another? So you're comparing the effects of two or more treatments on the same behavior. Your purpose in carrying out this sort of design is to determine which condition is more effective in changing one behavior. The basic premise of this is that when two or more treatments are alternated rapidly in time, you can evaluate the relative effects of the treatments. So there's a number of different ways that you can sort of put together or implement an alternating treatments design. One of the first ways is to do an alternating treatment design but with no baseline. So you don't collect a baseline, but you do present treatments randomly to your subject across different sessions or days or across different times of day. And we'll see an example of this a little bit later on. You can also implement this design by conducting a baseline and then following it up with your alternating treatments. So when you collect baseline data before you present the treatments, this provides additional information about changes from pre-treatment to treatment. So this is a stronger type of alternating treatments design. If you wanted to be the most thorough, you would conduct the kind of alternating treatments design that is a baseline followed by your alternating treatments, and then you can follow the alternating treatments up with a final treatment phase. So you look at the lines on the graph and you figure out which treatment was more effective, and then you carry out for a number of sessions that specific treatment that was deemed to be most effective. So let's look at some examples here graphed out. This particular design that you see is an alternating treatments design with no baseline. You'll note that there's also not a follow-up period of the therapy that was deemed to be most effective. What we have over on the left-hand side, it shows that we are measuring the frequency of stuttering. That is the behavior that we want to change. And they've left this really generic here, but you can see down at the bottom that there's two treatments that they're going to be administering. And they're calling it treatment number 1 and treatment number 2. So you can see as you look at the graph along the bottom there, they're alternating their treatments across sessions. In the Gottwald and Ness article, they actually alternated their treatments in the same session. So you can do this a number of different ways, but this example here is probably one of the most common. You can see that the line that's represented with circles, that's meant to represent treatment 1, and the line with the squares, that's meant to represent treatment 2. And just from looking at the graph, keeping in mind that we're measuring frequency of stuttering, so the higher the line, the more stuttering the person had, we can see that the line with the squares, that is that treatment 2, was much more effective at reducing the frequency of stuttering. So you simply look at the graph and you can tell by the line which treatment was the most effective. Another example of an alternating treatment study, this is more thorough. It's got a baseline, treatments are alternated rapidly, and then there is a follow-up phase of therapy, whichever therapy was deemed to be most effective. So I'll give you some background information on why this study was conducted. So a teacher noticed that students were making negative comments to each other during class times. She wanted to determine how she could encourage students to say nice things to each other. So she came up with two ways that she could encourage students to say positive things. Number 1, she could give them verbal praise when they said something positive, or number 2, she could give them a token like a sticker. So as you can see from the graph, she collected data from two students named Jimmy and Sue. And it's really important to note that she's not comparing Jimmy and Sue's results to each other. She just happened to be collecting data from more than one student. So you could certainly conduct this type of study with just one student. That would be more than appropriate. In fact, that would probably even be expected. So this teacher recorded the number of positive statements made by students each day in the baseline phase. The baseline phase is marked by A's on the graph. Note that she wasn't giving a verbal praise or a token yet, so it was just business as usual in the classroom. Once she had a stable baseline, she began to alternate the treatments. On the graph, you can see that B represents verbal praise and C represents a sticker token. Note that the alternating treatments should be relatively random. You don't just want to do B, C, B, C, B, C all the way across. It's okay to have some days where the same treatment is given back to back. So you can see that on the graph, that most of the time it's B, C, B, C, B, C, but then there are some days where there's two B's together or two C's together. To determine which treatment elicited more positive statements from students, we can look at the trend of the lines. In the case of Jimmy, the line representing the B treatment is consistently higher overall than the C treatment. So this means that for Jimmy, receiving verbal praise resulted in more positive statements. And the same happens to be true for Sue. In the case of this study, the teacher wanted to reinforce the results, so she ended with a final treatment phase. In this case, the B phase, or the verbal praise treatment, is extended for several more sessions. And as we can see from the line, the verbal praise continued to increase the number of positive things students said to each other. All right, so there are a number of advantages to be used with an alternating treatments design, and specifically you use this design when you want to look at the effectiveness of more than one treatment on a given behavior. When you can't collect baseline data or you can't really use your baseline data for some reason, you can jump right in and just start alternating the treatments. You have to make sure that the treatments are sufficiently different from each other and that participants can discriminate the treatment conditions. Otherwise, if the participant can't distinguish from one treatment from another, it just throws the validity of your whole study off. There are some disadvantages or times when you wouldn't want to use this type of study. For example, there really aren't a lot of controls for extraneous variables, so you can't really make statements about the absolute effects of treatment, but only the relative ones. So you kind of have to express the results of your study kind of cautiously. Another disadvantage is that it's not an appropriate design for behavior that is learned in stages. So if you've got a particular therapy that you're using that has to be learned in stages, you might want to take a close look and see if that's really appropriate. Once you've learned something, it's hard to sort of unlearn it. And finally, we shouldn't use an alternating treatments design when treatments need to be administered continuously to be effective. So for example, if I had a client with autism and I was thinking about using the ABA therapy, which I think is the Applied Behavioral Analysis therapy, I wouldn't want to rapidly alternate ABA therapy one day with another kind of therapy on a different day or a different session, because ABA therapy is supposed to be so rigid and so highly controlled, and you need that consistency day after day. So again, it would kind of invalidate the study if I were to use this kind of a setup for the design. So there we have an overview of the alternating treatments design. I will point out that in the Gottwald and Ness article, they did use the alternating treatments design. It was an example of a design where there was no baseline. There also was no final treatment phase. They gave the therapy within the session, so that's why the results are kind of compact, and it's all right there in the graph. The other thing is that they also used more than 2 types of therapy, which you can do. It gets more complicated that way. And what they also did is that they used what they called a control therapy, I guess. But that just meant that they had a moment in time or a couple of minutes where they were just collecting data from their client but that client wasn't receiving any sort of therapy sort of stimuli. So that's what they're terming control. It was kind of a no therapy moment in time. You don't have to do that in an alternating treatments design. And finally, they called the alternating treatments design I think they called it the multiple effects design. That's something that you can call this design, but I think that alternating treatments may just be a little bit more well known. So I hope that is a good overview for you. And of course, if you have any other questions, please feel free to get in touch with me.